Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to join the committee. Mr. Tillerson, during his campaign, the President-elect talked a lot about what he saw as major mistakes with NAFTA and with giving China full access to our market in terms of its impact on American manufacturing. He was very critical of the TPP. Do you share his vision that NAFTA and WTO, China access, and the TPP are big mistakes in terms of creating living wage American jobs?
Senator, my understanding of the issue that the President-elect has with those trade agreements is, in the case of NAFTA, it's an agreement that's been in place for decades now. And I think even President Peña Nieto of Mexico has indicated that, yes, perhaps it needs a relook, that we're in a different era now, both in terms of the type of trade and technology, but also the global trading environment has changed since that agreement.
And do you share his opposition to the TPP?
I do not oppose TPP. I share some of his views regarding whether the agreement that was negotiated serves all of America's interest best.
Thank you. Exxon has a partnership with Shell, a company known as Infinium, that did a fair number of transactions with Iran, bypassing U.S. sanctions. Are you familiar with the use of this subsidiary to bypass U.S. sanctions, and do you think it was the right thing to do?
I don't recall the incident. I've read about it, but I don't recall it specifically.
So the SEC directly contacted Exxon while you were in the senior leadership, saying this seems fairly material for investors, an effort to bypass U.S. sanctions, and asked why Exxon didn't disclose it. Do you have any memory of that or discussions of whether Exxon should have disclosed these transactions?
Senator, I think the question would be best placed to ExxonMobil where the information would reside.
Oh, no, sir. You were there. I'm asking if you had discussions about this or have a memory of it.
I do not.
If you were Secretary of State and you were working to enforce U.S. sanctions and another CEO had a subsidiary set up and utilized to bypass American sanctions, would you call up that CEO or weigh in and say, this is not a good idea, this undermines U.S. efforts to take on a serious terrorist threat or other malfeasance by some country of the world?
I think if the actions that are being taken violate the sanctions, then there are proper authorities that would examine that and deal with it.
It's not an issue of the technicality of violating this. The operation subsidiary was set up in Europe specifically that Exxon set up so it could legally bypass U.S. sanctions, but it was certainly inconsistent with the goal of U.S. policy to pressure Iran. And if you were the leader of you were Secretary of State, would you try to make sure that U.S. leadership and the effectiveness of using sanctions was not undermined through the setup of foreign subsidiaries?
I would certainly be open to having having folks in the State Department contact companies and just inquire as to whether they're aware of the actions that they're taking and the State Department's view of that.
Well, to be aware of something is different than to be concerned or to be upset by it. Would you consider you would uphold the integrity of the U.S. goal of diminishing the ability of nations like Iran to do a whole host of things destructive to U.S. interests?
I understand, Senator, but I also think it's important that the State Department, as with any agency, also respects the laws that have been put in place. And there's a difference between expressing a concern and suggesting someone's breaking the law.
Yes. Yes. So as you look back on the subsidiary, it doesn't upset you that Exxon took this role to undermine U.S. sanctions and that you would not express concern if another company legally set up a foreign subsidiary to undermine U.S. sanctions?
As I said, I don't recall the circumstances.
Well, I'm not asking you to recall the circumstances. I'm asking your answer is that you don't consider that a problem. It sounds like you're not considering that to be an issue.
I don't know the example, so I don't know how to answer the question.
Okay, that's all. Well, thank you. Let's turn to lobbying in the Ukraine. You said earlier in this hearing, I've never personally lobbied against sanctions. To my knowledge, Exxon never lobbied against sanctions. And yet there's a whole host of material in the public sector about Exxon lobbying on these sanctions. There's a whole host of these lobbying reports in which Exxon reports under the law that they lobbied on these bills that imposed sanctions. There's your report at the 2014 meeting, and I quote, "We do not support sanctions generally." And you continued, "So we always encourage the people who are making those decisions to consider the very broad collateral damage of who are they really harming." And I'd like to enter these articles into the record if I could. And its article is titled from the New York Times, "Rex Tillerson's company Exxon has billions at stake over sanctions on Russia." Political article lays out ExxonMobil helped defeat Russia sanctions bill and notes how ExxonMobil successfully lobbied against a bill that would make it harder for the next president to lift sanctions against Russia. Another article lays out Tillerson visited the White House often over the Russian sanctions. So there's a host of material showing a widespread pattern of weighing in against these sanctions that were harming Exxon interests activities in Russia, which was a major area of your effort. Do you still maintain that Exxon did not lobby against these sanctions?
ExxonMobil did not lobby against the sanctions, but were engaged in how the sanctions would be constructed. As to the reports of my visits to the White House, my visits were to work through the process of ExxonMobil's compliance with the sanctions. I described earlier the situation where when the sanctions were enacted, there were drilling activities that involved considerable risk that were underway, for which ExxonMobil sought a special license from OFAC in order to complete those in full compliance with the sanctions. Had we been denied the license, we would have had to pull people out, or ExxonMobil would have had to pull people out at that time.
And is that the only instance in which you weighed in?
And all of the other
relation to
meetings,
sanctions?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
What, 20 meetings going to the White House, that's the only issue you weighed in on Exxon's sanctions?
I don't recall 20 meetings, but the visits to the White House, because under the terms of the compliance with the sanctions, the first action was to seek the license to allow us to deal with the imminent risk of the drilling situation. Following that, OFAC required ExxonMobil to file reports on a periodic basis around our ongoing compliance activities. ExxonMobil has holdings in Russia, offshore Sakhalin Island, that are not subject to the sanctions. In partnership with Rosneft, which does contain individuals who are subject to the sanctions.
I'm going to summarize that these reports you consider to be incorrect.
They are inaccurate.
Okay, thank you. I'll continue. There are 3 individuals who were involved in the Trump campaign, Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen, and Carter Page, who public reports have been involved in dialogue with Russia with the goal of finding a common strategy, with Russia believing that Trump would be better on Syria and Ukraine policy, and Trump believing that Russia could help defeat Hillary Clinton. Now, these reports have not been substantiated. I'm sure much more will come on them. But in theory, how do you feel about a U.S. candidate turning to a foreign country to essentially find another partner in defeating another opponent in a U.S. presidential election?
That would not comport with our democratic process.
Thank you. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of discussion of this because the extent of the false news stories, the hacking, the cyber warfare, the use of botnets to amplify false news stories, the hiring of trolls, all of which really attack the fundamentals of our democracy. And the reports have it that Russia not only wanted to weigh in the election, but they also wanted to undermine U.S. confidence, the citizens' confidence in our electoral process and in our democratic values. So that's a real concern to the future of our state, and I assume it's a concern that you might share as well.
Yes, sir. It's a concern I share. I also noted in the publicly available report that I read that the interagency report also acknowledged that these types of activities were carried out during the Cold War as well. The tools of sophistication have only advanced with the advent of cyber.
Yes, many of these tools were internet-based, electronic cyber warfare that was much different in that setting. When we come back in our next round, because a few seconds left, I'd like to ask a few questions about Exxon's involvement in Equatorial Guinea. My colleague mentioned it on the other side, and I think that would be of interest. Thank you.